I always tell myself that, leadership is not friendship. It's not leading a group of people does not mean that we're automatically friends and family and things like that. So leadership isn't friendship, but it does require the same level of fairness and integrity that you would extend to a friend. That is what I would say is when I don't get along with somebody, like, on a personal level or even a professional level, I have to bring that emotional maturity forward and treat them, even if I dislike them, with absolute professionalism.
Hey, Samir, how's it going?
Going well. How about yourself?
Doing well, thank you. Coming off a World Series baseball late evening, so a little tuckered, but fired up nonetheless. So today, I wanted to talk about EQ in a little bit of a different angle. We've talked about how great EQ is, and it is, but always from like a positive lens and always with positive outcomes. And I think we've all said this before, the whole cliche of let's agree to disagree. And I feel like this is an overused term and it doesn't really get to the crux of solving an issue. It's almost like leaving things a little bit sour and just moving on.
To the extent where you have two parties that don't want to clean up the mess and they're just like, yeah, we're just going to leave that there.
Yeah, just sweep it under the rug. And it's a big lump. It's not even like flat. It's there. It's visible, but everyone's ignoring it. And so I wanted to cover 4 areas today. And what is beyond agree to disagree, and then how empathy can be a paradoxical issue, and then, leading and living or working with people that you might not just get along with. And then is this something that's really repairable?
Yeah, no, the agree to disagree one is really interesting. You mentioned it. We've talked about EQ always as this enhancer of your leadership skills. And, if you can implement EQ or utilize EQ in every situation, you will lead to a positive outcome. But sometimes you use your EQ to lead to an outcome that may be the best outcome in the situation, but not necessarily a positive one. And so that's where I think agree to disagree. It feels in the moment like it's something that is positive, but it's really just delaying an inevitable, right? It's well, you could maybe consider it like a surface civility, right? You're telling the other person, hey, we're just going to be cool. But the trust factor between those two individuals does go down quite a bit when you're working day in and day out on a framework of just agreeing for the sake of not having that conflict or not reckoning with the situation at hand.
Uncomfortable to say the least. It's challenging for the best of us, right?
An EQ standpoint, right? Now we're talking about looking at this. How do we utilize our EQ in these situations? How are you making that shift from an EQ standpoint, from, going from an agreeing to disagree, sweep it under the rug sort of a approach to now I am going to do this in a way that is emotionally intelligent?
Right. This is one of those situations where I think understanding a person isn't necessarily agreeing with them. You can hold those two things at the same time. I think actually it's critical that we're able to hold those two things at the same time. And I think the high EQ leader, they are holding empathy, they're being empathetic, but I think they're acknowledging that there is a disagreement and working with that person to acknowledge that there is a disagreement.
Yeah, just like that authentic kind of honesty, right? Hey, you and I are not seeing eye to eye on this issue. That creates discomfort between us. Let's not pretend like we're cool about this, And then that actually humanizes the relationship. It builds trust rather than degrading trust, because now you don't have all these preconceived or post-conceived notions about what the other may be thinking. Those inferences aren't being made. Everything's being laid out on the table, and you're able to say, you know exactly how I feel about this. I know exactly how you feel about this. And now let's handle this tension with a degree of dignity.
Yes.
And let's really, really, look at this and make a resolution that's final. And one of us may walk away from this unhappy, and maybe both of us walk away from this unhappy, but there's productive progress being made,
And there's something called this Trojan horse of empathy, right? Where you are listening to the other person just to rebut what they're saying. This happens, I would say, more often than we think. I think it happens subconsciously and consciously for that matter. And I think this is a really dangerous path to go down because it increases animosity potentially. And you're not actually spending the time hearing the person, right? You're listening, but do you really hear them? And I think that there's a solid test here. There's something to be said about the other person or you, depending on what side you're on, is like, did they understand me before they disagreed with me? Did I feel like, Samir, you understood my side of things before you said, you know what, I still think it's wrong?
Yeah, and when we go back to the whole EQ conversation, making others feel heard and truly caring, right? That's what it comes down to. Is you actually have to approach a conversation with an open mind, have to be willing to listen, you have to be willing to meet somebody potentially where they are if that's what's needed to move the situation forward. And so that does kind of bring us to that empathy conversation. You brought that up. True EQ means, holding empathy, being able to be empathetic and hold disagreements at the same time. That is part of it. It's just what it is. Understanding somebody's point of view does not necessarily equate to endorsing their belief system. And so no, I was just gonna say that, you know, high EQ leaders, they will really try their best to understand how people get to where they get to, and then, they can still believe that that view is wrong.
That's right. I mean, I guess when you're talking about high EQ leaders and a team around them, either it be peers or leading people that you just might not get along with, what are your thoughts on how one might handle that situation?
I always tell myself that, leadership is not friendship. It's not leading a group of people does not mean that we're automatically friends and family and things like that. So leadership isn't friendship, but it does require the same level of fairness and integrity that you would extend to a friend. That is what I would say is when I don't get along with somebody, like, on a personal level or even a professional level, I have to bring that emotional maturity forward and treat them, even if I dislike them, with absolute professionalism.
Right. There is a mutual respect that needs to be present for there to be a productive relationship in a situation where you're not seeing eye to eye or you just don't, we'll just say you just don't like them or they don't like you, right?
And I've had these situations before, right, where there may have been somebody that works for me that from a personal level or even a professional level, we just don't mesh well.
Right.
Maybe a situation or a relationship has declined over time due to different things that have happened. And in those situations, I still will say extending that professionalism, perhaps you go to a more strict kind of task-based management style where you're kind of just speaking more via email, to-do lists, get this done, let me know when this is done. You still have your weekly check-ins or whatnot, but that relationship doesn't really go beyond the work itself.
What are your thoughts or opinions on the idea of like faking it or fake it until you make it from the perspective of a relationship with someone, a working relationship?
Well, we talk about as a leader how important authenticity is, right? And so I try my best to be as authentic as possible, pretending to care about somebody more deeply than just as a professional peer who you need to rely on to get the work done. Just pretending in general, I think it's kind of toxic in nature in a big way, like you'll
Right.
end up it won't pass the sniff test after a certain amount of time.
Right.
I can fake it for a day, a week, maybe a month. Eventually that relationship will sour to the point where either that person ends up leaving my team, maybe going to another organization within the company, or I might have to have that honest conversation with them like, hey, trust has broken down to an irreparable level between us.
Right.
And as a leader, for me, that's sort of the worst case scenario. It's probably like a fail moment for me. And that's how I would take it personally. But sometimes you have to kind of move on. You have
Right.
to make those necessary changes for the overall sort of health of the team, but also just, for stress levels on both sides of that relationship.
In that case, the EQ, air quote, move would be moving on, saying like, I'm not the right leader for you, or you're not the right employee for me. And I guess that kind of takes us to the situation, or brings up the notion that there are situations that are not repairable, right?
Yes.
We are saying that. And you know what? I would say that not every conflict or situation needs to be fixed. Sometimes it just has to be a certain way. Trying to be the fixer, I am a people pleaser, right? And it's something that I will always be recovering from. I'm a recovering people pleaser, we'll say,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Okay, okay.
And what I think I need to learn is that, or work on, or continuously work on, is that there are situations that are broken, and no matter what I say or what I do, it won't be fixed, and I should leave it that way. And so endless processing, trying to make things better, is actually not productive, right? It's probably hurting my performance.
Yeah. And no, honestly, and I think sometimes leaders get caught up in a bit of that savior complex where they're like, I'm going to save this person. They're misguided. They're on the wrong path. I'm going to bring them onto the right path, and my leadership will take them to the promised land. And leaders get overly idealistic sometimes, and that's not reality, right? Not every single conflict can be healed or resolved, and that's okay, right? And I know earlier I kind of joked that if I had to let go of somebody because I wasn't seeing eye to eye, that I would see that as a failure. Yes, I mean, it would hurt me, but sometimes, that's reality. That's what happens, and we have to learn to be okay with that.
You know what, I think a better way to look at it, or what you're trying to describe, is that it's kind of painful for you to have to be in that situation. Not a fail, but it hurts,
Yeah,
because you would wish, anyone would wish for there to be a positive outcome. I know you wouldn't just pass on that without giving it your all. And
yeah,
even after giving it your all, and you still aren't able to make progress, I think it's the smart move there is to be like, okay, we have irreconcilable differences, and I have to be okay with that.
yeah. And a key part of that, though, is that both, like, everybody's cards have to be put out on the table before you give up on it, right? You have to be able to share exactly what the roadblocks have been with that person for you personally. And then you have to be ready to hear what their issues and challenges have been toward you, or maybe a particular scope of work that you're managing. And then you come to a decision after hearing them out with an open mind on whether or not you can continue to work together. But if you can't, again, yes, that does not mean that, you have failed or that person is bad. It's just sometimes things just, you got to move on. You just have to move on.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, look, by no means, I think, am I or are we saying this is an easy task. This whole concept
Yep.
of you having to come to terms with a negative or not positive situation, and it's difficult. It is really, really hard.
It is.
And I think that this is where you're able, if you're looking at things or a problem at this level, this is the high mature EQ perspective. This is when
Yes.
you are firing on all cylinders. This is when you're doing stuff like this is when you're running a high performing team.
Yeah. And because you've been able to take all of the emotion, analyze it, add a human element to it, and recognizing that, hey, not everything can just be agree to disagree.
Yes. And I think we've said this before, is that EQ isn't about being nice. It's about being effective. And sometimes being effective is taking into account these 3 or 4 things that we talked about today.
Yeah. No, this is a great convo. Appreciate you bringing this thought forward. Well, I think it's something that is often, uh, you know, swept under the rug, as
Yeah.
we said. We put so much emphasis on leading in this pristine, perfect way, but there is a lot of discomfort in leading. There's a lot of lack of clarity and just dirtiness that we have to acknowledge as well. And I think this particular topic is right in that realm. So thank you. It was great chat.
Absolutely. Thanks.